Thank you very much, Madam President. Fellows, honoured guests, I greet you all well, and I'm really very sensible to the great honour that you've given me to speak to you this evening, because I feel a bit of a fraud, because I'm not an academic, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm just a learned historian. I'm known in the trade as a hack journalist and also by certain senior police officers as troublemaking lawyer, and I'm happy with both descriptions. I'm a man of little Latin and no Greek, that may help you. And the FSA is one of the only two of the post-novels that I use. I have quite a few, but I always find it very, very useful. I use it to ingratiate myself with Her Majesty's judges, I seduce juries with it, and I browbeat prosecutors with it. And I have to say it's blooming useful, and thank you very much. This is my way of paying the society back for abusing its post-novels for many years. My aim in life is to popularise history, and I try to do that by embracing the Reithian principles to educate, inform, and entertain people, and particularly the latter. People remember what they've enjoyed. They don't tend to remember what they haven't enjoyed. So I was trying to bring a bit of a humorous side to things to try and plant ideas in people's minds. And I always think it better that somebody should read a piece of popular history and be entertained by it than read some large and wonderfully academic dusty tome and forget about it. I think there's an exercise in communication somewhere. I also worked in the Birmingham Gun Trade, which I'm going to speak to you. In the 1980s, I had a Saturday job with Mr. Holloway of Holloway and Norton, who were based in Birmingham. Graham Holloway died in the 1990s, in his 90s, and he was one of the last great principals of the Birmingham gun-ranking firms. He was a bit of a grumpy old man, but he liked me and I liked him. I think he liked me because I had a genuine interest in what his heritage was and what his history was, and that I really would like to see things like that continue. Things haven't continued because, like many things, trades live, they die. And I'm very pleased to have seen the Birmingham trade, I think, at the very last knockings of it. But I never saw it really in its decayed glory in the 1960s. I didn't come to Birmingham until 1971. I have a little book which records that visit. So I didn't really see the gun quarter, as you will hear, in its final glory before it came down to make way for the inner ring road. Tonight I'd like to talk briefly about the trade as an overview, and then follow it up with some slides. And I'd like to start with a quotation from William Blake. "And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here, amongst those dark satanic mills?" And it's my experience that our perception of industrial archaeology is really coloured by that phrase, dark satanic mills. Today I want to show you that that's perhaps not the perception we should have, because the Birmingham Gun Trade, although it was incredibly important in what was known as the city of 1,000 trades, didn't have those huge factories like we see in Manchester in the wool trade, in the Yorkshire cotton trade, and in Lancashire. There's huge, great brick-built structures that housed hundreds and hundreds of workers, all bent over their looms and machinery. You just don't see that in Birmingham. And yet its output was sufficiently important that it was one of the great trades of what is really Britain's second city. So if you look at the growth of Birmingham as a market town, it's really not much different from anything else. In the Middle Ages it grew as it became a centre for the distribution of agricultural produce, and it had its market, and it had its bullring. And we know that the shopping centre today is known as the Bullring, and that comes from the cattle enclosure where cattle were penned up on market days when they were getting ready to be sold. And the first quote that I would like to talk to you about with Birmingham as an industrial centre comes from the travelling churchman John Leland, who in 1538 visited Birmingham. And this is what Mr. Leland has to say. I came through a pretty street, or whatever I entered Birmingham. This street, as I remember, is called Dirty, that's Derrit End. It dwells many smiths and cutlers, and there is a brook that divides this street from Birmingham. There be many smiths in the town that used to make knives and all manner of cutting tools, and many lorimers that make bits, and a great many nailers, so that the great part of the town is maintained by smiths, who have their iron and sea coal out of Staffordshire. So there we are. You see Birmingham is really becoming industrialised, it's becoming a metalworking centre, and as well as the iron and steel, you get work in precious metals as well, which would manifest itself in what became known as the Jewellery Quarter, and which is still largely active today. And I do recommend you, if you go to Birmingham, go to the Jewellery Quarter Museum. It is fantastic. It hasn't changed since the people who owned the factory upon which it's based closed it down in the 1980s, and it really is very, very good. We move on, and in 1586 the historian William Camden described the town in his biographical survey of Britannia as swarming with inhabitants and echoing with the noise of smiths, for here are great numbers of anvils and other artificers in iron and steel, whose performance in that way are greatly admired both at home and abroad. So you can see that this great industrial city is starting to find its feet and is becoming more than just an agricultural market town somewhere in the Midlands, and is really becoming a great industrial base. During the Civil Wars, it was put to the sword and to the torch by Prince Rupert in 1643 because it had supplied sword blades to the parliamentary army. And Prince Rupert did a great deal of damage to the town, killed many of the townspeople, and there are still several popular ballads about it today. But it wasn't really until the 1690s that Birmingham's gun trade started to come alive. If I can just allude briefly, you start to see gun making really happening in Britain from about the Elizabethan era. Henry VIII owned quite a few guns. They're on the various inventories. There are a couple in the Royal Armouries. But they were really owned by, I suppose, noble, royal people. And they were owned as curiosities, really. Nobody hunted with a gun. People hunted with crossbows, or they hunted with dogs and hawks. But guns were just really there for a bit of amusement on Saturday afternoon. But it wasn't until the 1690s until you start to see Birmingham getting its recognition as a gun-making centre. And Sir William Newdigate, Richard Newdigate, I beg your pardon, who was the MP for Warwickshire, looking after his constituents, being a good constituency MP, so rare these days when people are just professional politicians, he petitioned the Board of Ordnance to supply muskets for King William's wars, and said, my constituents can make these as well. You don't need to go to the gun trade in London. You can have them from Birmingham. They'll make you muskets. And the first of what are called the Newdigate contracts is still preserved today in the Birmingham Proof House. And it says, imprimis, the said William Bourne, Thomas Moore, John West, Richard Weston, and Jacob Austin do hereby severally covenant and agree to, and with the said principal officers of their Majesty's Ordnance on behalf of themselves and the rest of the gunmakers of Birmingham, so it's quite clear that it was a centre even then, that they shall and will make and provide for their Majesty's service 200 snap-hand muskets every month for the space of 1 year. A snap-hand musket was a flintlock musket, a fairly early one, which didn't rely on a length of burning cord like many of the early muskets did. It actually struck its own spark, so it went off when you wanted it to, not when it felt like it. But 200 muskets a month is a lot to make, and you really start to see that basis of military arms making in Birmingham start with the Newdigate contracts. It really started as a tradition of supplying the government with arms. They were always ordered very late, and there was absolutely no pre-planning by the Board of Ordnance. You got a massive emergency, and they said, oh, we'd like some muskets, please. Nobody ever bothered to think, well, we ought to keep the troops properly armed, but no, I suppose it's much the same today. So you see muskets made for the War of Spanish Succession, where Marlborough gave the French a damn good drubbing. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the wars with revolutionary France from 1793 onwards, and of course the Napoleonic Wars from 1804 to 1815. And also, as well as military arms, it's very important to remember that the Birmingham Gun Trade produced lots and lots of civilian arms, both for internal consumption and also for export. And Lord Sherborne in 1765 noted in his journal that the trade sent annually above 150,000 guns to the coast of Africa. That's a lot of muskets, and they will have been part of the triangle that produced slaves, sugar, manufactured goods. To produce this number of firearms, you start to see metalworking really increasing, and proof of that is that there were 2 iron and steel production factories in what is still known as Steelhouse Lane, which is a street in Birmingham which used to be in the heart of the gun quarter. But if you look at some of the old maps, you see at the top of the lane so-and-so Steelhouse, and that gave its name to the lane. In 1813, it's a very, very seminal date, the trade came of its own because the proof house, and London had enjoyed its own proof house since 1637, was set up, and that gave the trade the access to get its firearms proof tested. And proof is a test which is still done today. It's a test to near destruction, and the pressure of the firearm is put up to 2.5 times its normal working pressure. If it hasn't blown up by then, it's probably not going to blow up when you use it with a normal cartridge. So it's very, very important. And I think that you can get some idea of the importance of Birmingham from the total figures of the military arms that it supplied during the Napoleonic Wars. And I think I could be justified in referring it to as the arsenal of the nation, because in complete weapons and military barrels and gun locks, and they were quite often supplied separately. They're almost like FX kits, which were given to members of the trade who are known as setters up, and they set up the bits of manufactured goods, the barrels, the furniture, the walnut stock blank, and they set it up into a musket or a pistol. And there was 7,666,229 made across that period. And that doesn't include the million or so components that were supplied to the London contractors, and also to the 500,000 sporting arms supplied each year. That's a great, great degree of guns. And it showed that not only was the trade supplying the nation for its military arms, but also for its commercial arms. And there's always been a great deal of rivalry between the London and Birmingham trades, so I always feel a bit on my mettle when I'm in London, being a man who's worked in the Birmingham trade. But the London trade really depends on the Birmingham trade for a lot of its components and also for its skills. And I think in the days of railways and canals, it was not uncommon for firearms to be moved up to Birmingham, to have some process done to them, and then brought back down to London to be sold. And there was also, I think, a greater cachet from selling a gun in London and having a name put Bloggs Gunmaker London than trying to sell it in Birmingham. And I think if you look at the prices of the catalogues, for instance, the Midland Gun Company, which was a very popularist producer of firearms, which produced very large numbers and disparity of guns. You could buy a gun from them for 12 shillings, but you could also buy a best gun from them for 50 guineas, and it was as good as that which the London trade would sell you for 120. But today, nobody will pay anything like the money that they would for a gun marked London than the same one marked Birmingham. So it's that sort of snobbishness that has crept into differentiating the two trades. But in reality, I think you probably find the London trade marketed itself slightly better. After the Napoleonic Wars ended, you start to see the increase in importance in the Lee Valley to the north of London, and that is really centred around the town of Enfield, and also the Royal Gunpowder Mills at Waltham Abbey. They're all connected to the Thames, and that's very, very easy for completed arms to be shipped down to the Port of London and then out across through the Thames estuary. And it's also easy for the Board of Ordnance to control things as well. Not so easy for them to do it in Birmingham, although they would doubtless have their representatives there, but to be able to have manufacturing on your doorstep was very important. And you see the Royal Small Arms Factory starting to really make huge inroads into the Birmingham trade from the 1630s to the 1640s. You don't see any real major contracts given to the Birmingham gunmakers for military arms after the government has stepped in and set its own arsenal up. I think it's very interesting that Britain did it so late, because continental states had their own arsenals from the middle of the 18th century, whereas in Britain we waited until the third decade of the 19th to do it. It was really the death knell for British military arms, and so the trade then started to concentrate on sporting arms, on military pattern arms. It still made military pattern arms, but they weren't made for the British government, or not very much. They were made for other governments, and of course it made arms for export. And you start to see it migrate from where it started life at Derrit End to the gun quarter, which is in the northeast of the city, and it's really bounded by Steelhouse Lane, Slaney, Loveday and Shadwell Streets, and it's based around St Mary's churchyard, and this was really envisaged as dwelling houses for the middle classes, but the process by which this domestic area became industrialised was that a gunmaker would move into a house with his family, and Mrs. Gunmaker and the kids would live in the back, and he and his workmen would have one of the front rooms, would produce the guns in there, and so you got both living and manufacturing in the same building. And eventually, as his business expanded and became more profitable, Mrs. Gunmaker and the children would probably go and live in Coalfield or somewhere nicer than that, and the whole house would then be given over to industry. And not only was the house taken over, but also was the garden. And it's not uncommon that you see industrial units made from the most dreadfully cheap materials built in the gardens of houses, certainly in the gun quarter, particularly in St Mary's Row. I'll come on to those, I have some pictures of those. And they were known as shopping. And you get this backward expansion, which created these rabbit warrens, which had a myriad of workers in it, and there was a huge division of labour. And if you look at the tasks that people admitted to practising on the censuses, you see that there are 18 material men, i.e. the people who made the bits of the guns, and then the setters up, as I've explained earlier, who put together this big airfix kit of gun pieces and produced the final thing. There were 14 of those. So there's a lot of people, and I think when you look at a finished gun from Birmingham, it's probably gone through between 20 and 30 pairs of hands. There was a very great division of labour. For instance, the children were often set to making screws in the morning before they went to school. The trade calls screws pins, and it calls pins, what we would call a pin, a peg. So it has its own language. What was Birmingham like at the time? Well, there was a man called Charles Dickens saw it, and he recorded his experience, excuse me, so I'll move that slide in Pickwick Papers in 1836. This is what he said about Birmingham. The straggling cottages by the roadside, the dingy hue of every object visible, the murky atmosphere, the paths of cinders and brick dust, the deep red glow of furnace fires in the distance, the volumes of dense smoke issuing heavily forth from high toppling chimneys, blackening and obscuring everything around, the glare of distant lights, the ponderous wagons which toiled along the road, laden with crashing rods of iron or piled with heavy goods, all betokened their rapid approach to the great working town of Birmingham. As they rattled through the narrow thoroughfares leading to the heart of the turmoil, the sights and sounds of earnest occupation struck more forcibly on the senses. The streets were thronged with working people. The hum of labour resounded from every house. Lights gleamed from the long casement windows in the attic stories, and the whirl of wheels and noise of machinery shook the trembling walls. The fires, whose lurid, sullen light had been visible for miles, blazed fiercely up in the great works and factories of the town. The din of hammers, the rushing of steam, the dead, heavy clanking of engines was the harsh music which arose from every quarter. Fantastic description, isn't it? By one of England's basic, really descriptive authors. And he wasn't just a novelist, he made some very, very fine descriptions of Colt's factory in Pimlico as well for household words. It's very well worth the read. You see in 1854, Crimea, an attempt by 20 of Birmingham's leading gunmakers. They formed themselves together into a cartel called the Birmingham Small Arms Trade to compete with the Royal Small Arms Manufactory at Enfield for military contracts. Not very successful. I think I've seen 3 or 4 muskets marked with Birmingham Small Arms Trade, but they did make arms for other governments, and they got lots of repair work from the government, and I think that's always kept them going. In the mid-1860s, the Enfield rifle musket, which was a muzzle loader, you took the rod and you threw it down the barrel to push the cartridge home to the bottom where the bullet and the powder were ignited by the cap. That was converted to a breech loader by a system invented by an American gent called Jacob Snyder, and Birmingham converted 156,000 of those rifle muskets. It was quite an easy process. You just cut the barrel off and screwed a breech shoe on with this little hinged door that allowed for breech loading. Obviously somebody had to make those, so that's where the material men came in. Also, it converted rifles for Russia under the Krunker system, and it was again supported by an MP. There was a chap called Muntz who supported the trade, and I think you get very much in those times MPs really supporting and looking for their constituencies, actually having a base in that constituency rather than just simply representing it in Parliament. What was the trade like? Well, we're told in some great detail in 1860 by a chap called G.C. Allen, and he writes, "A passage from a main street communicates with a courtyard from which 2 blocks of 2-storey buildings rise, facing one another. At intervals, staircases lead up from the courtyard to the workshops, of which the buildings are entirely composed. Each shop composed of 1 or 2 small rooms in which the various operations in connection with the setting up of guns are performed. In one shop, 2 men will be found engaged in barrel browning. In another, a single workman is shaping the gun stocks from a pile of roughly cut wooden blocks delivered to him by the master gunmaker. Farther down the street, a narrow alley communicates with an ill-lighted room where 2 barrel filers, whose work is known throughout Europe, are engaged. Each craftsman works for one or several gunmakers and receives the material from them, but hires his own workshop and pays his own assistants." It tells you quite a lot about the way that the trade organises itself. Certainly, when you get breech-loading shotguns, i.e. ones that you just drop a cartridge into the breech and close the barrels and fire it, rather than the muzzle-loading ones, you get far more concentration of gun making away from the provinces. It's not hard to build a muzzle-loading gun if you're reasonably skilled at metalwork, but it's remarkably difficult to make a breech-loading gun. There's a lot of precision engineering work and a lot of skilled handwork in it. And so you see very few provincial gun makers surviving. And whilst you might get a gun which said Fred Bloggs, gunmaker Ludley, you could be absolutely certain that Mr. Bloggs' only contact with that gun was to take it out of the box with the winch, in which it arrived from the carrier, put it in his window. He was really no more than a retailer. You start to see some important dates of the trade. You get the Crimean War, I've spoken about, in 1853. 57, the Indian Mutiny, again, a large call for more arms. But the most important, and I think it has to be the zenith of the Birmingham trade, is the American Civil War in 1861. Both sides used Enfields, and to give you some anecdotes from that, the gun trade got very, very wealthy, and it is said, and it may well be one of these urban legends, that there was one gun maker who used to drive 500 yards to his work in a carriage and have his hat brought in a separate one behind him. They said that gun makers lit cigars with £5 notes in pubs. Believe it. And at Little Round Top, Colonel Joshua Chambers' regiment, so Gettysburg in 1863, the 20th May, whose holding of Little Round Top was on the Union left flank, and they really saw the Confederates off. They denied their flank to them originally and then charged them with the bayonet as their ammunition ran low. What were they using? They weren't using Springfield muskets, they had Enfields. And they disliked them, and they said they weren't as good as the Springfields. I have to take a different view, but I didn't fight at Little Round Top, although many people say I'm old enough to have done so. You then get, in 1864, the government orders from America just suddenly stop and dry up because it's quite clear the war's ending and they've got enough small arms. 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, very, very important. From 1875 on, you see the ingenuity of the Birmingham trade, and it wins the field gun trials, and it's always very, very inventive. Between 1879 and 1897, some really punitive foreign trade tariffs really made it very, very difficult to sell British guns abroad. There was a prohibitive order for India in 1900, which prohibited the export of any cartridge with a 450 bullet, because that was used by people who are causing difficulty on the northwest frontier to reload cartridges, and there's always been this industry that recycles things, and it cut off a lot of the Indian markets. And in 1907, two chaps who titled themselves Artifacts and Opifacts wrote a book called Causes of Decay in the British Industry, and much of their complaint was things were very much cheaper in Liège in Belgium, where the wages were cheaper, the materials cheaper. But one of their greatest complaints was that there was hostile legislation introduced by the British government that stopped their trade. And I think from thence onwards you see this great decline which took off. And of course, First World War, it dealt a terrible blow. It killed a generation of men. It took away the skilled workmen who were employed as armourers, and many of whom didn't come back. But I think more importantly, it took away the customers of the trade, who were just literally wiped out. And I think at the end of the war, there was a feeling that people didn't want to shoot things anymore. You know, they had enough killing. And I think it's very, very instructive when you read a clip from the Times in 1932 about the winding up of the London firm, applicable to Birmingham as well, of Charles Lancaster, and the man who owned it, Alan Thorne. Alan Thorne, the managing director, stated the failure and insolvency of the company to the loss of customers during the Great War by death, involving the loss of a generation of potential customers, the popularity of the motor car, high tariff walls and restrictions, lack of capital, and decreases in shooting owing to the changing and social and economic conditions. The trade had a bit of a renaissance between the two wars, and we always talk about the golden age of gun making, which is the 20s or 30s. If you're going to go and buy an expensive shotgun, that's the sort of period you should be aiming for. But really, it was always fighting off the Belgians. And it's interesting to note that in Arms and Explosives magazine, there's always a regular report on what the Liège trade is doing. They were clearly so exercised by the activities of, ironically, the people whose neutrality they had stood up for in 1914, that they always featured a small report on the Belgian trade. St Mary's Church, which we'll see when we get to the slides, was demolished in 1925, and you really start to see the whole area just running down. In the post-Second World War, the import of numerous Spanish copies of English guns made for half the price of an English gun and much as good. They're a bit lumpier, a bit heavier perhaps, the balance wasn't as good, but they were good enough for most sportsmen. I started my shooting career off with an AYA number 2, and I thought it as good as the Holland gun from London that it copied. And also, most importantly, you see really hostile domestic legislation in the form of the Firearms Act 1920, and we've seen it ever since up until the Firearms Act of the Amendment Act of 1997. The gun quarter was largely demolished in the 1960s, and what remains of the trade, very, very little. There's a bit of repair work, that's really about it. So, the reasons for the decline, in no particular order: loss of British military contracts, a failure to take on apprentices. There was no succession planning, it was all very family-based, and people regarded apprentices not as new opportunities to train young blood, but as potential competitors. Mechanisation by the Americans. They were always short of skilled labour, and they were very good at making things by machinery. Hostile gun legislation, cheaper labour costs in Liège, hostile trade tariffs, a lack of UK government overseas supporting the trade, the division of labour. It was certainly, when you got a quiet period in the trade, it just went off to another trade that made items out of iron and steel, particularly the chain-making trade, changing social conditions, and inflation. So that's the brief overview of the trade. Here are the slides, which I promised you. That's what we're looking at, the gun quarter. You can see it bounded by the 4 streets there. In the centre, there. Ooh, it works. Thank you, Ronnie. There's St Mary's Chapel. And that was really the centre. You see a lot of gun makers, they say, address St Mary's Square, Birmingham. It sounds terribly leafy and very nice, but it was actually pretty grim and industrial. There's an engraving of St Mary's Chapel, which was a chapel of ease for St Martin's and the Bullring, which just simply couldn't cope with the burgeoning population. And it was described by the Warwickshire historian John Dent as too much roof and too little steeple. And it would seat 2,000 people, you know, an amazing number, and it was a hotbed of religious radicalism as well. But anyway, that went in 1925. That is a Kempson halfpenny token. There was a great shortage of coinage in the Napoleonic Wars, as you probably know, and that's 1797, and you see St Mary's Church there on these views of Birmingham. I've always wanted one of those, and I've been waiting for a long time to acquire one. I will have one one day. That one's in Birmingham Museum. That's a picture of Ford's workshop. He owned the Eclipse Gun Works, as you can see there. And it was not uncommon for these very obviously middle-class dwelling houses to have the company's name painted onto the brickwork. So you see Eclipse Gun Works there, Mr. Ford, and next door to him the Patent Gas Government Company. What one of those is, I don't know, perhaps someone here can tell me. And next door to that, you see at number 13, William Tranter's Works. He was a very great gun maker in Birmingham. Well, that worked out. I find that very exciting to know that I can look at that picture, I can hold this revolver and know exactly where it came from. Please, when I finish, do come and have a look at this. Try not to shoot each other, it would be helpful if I could manage that. I've also got here printing blocks from Ford's original catalogue. There's only one known amongst collectors, and that's about 1913. Again, I think it's very, very exciting to know that if you looked on about 17 years from when this picture was taken, very evocative, little street lamps and patient horses standing there, in one of those rooms in there, there was probably somebody in Ford's business putting these catalogues in an envelope to promote his business. I found that all very, very exciting. I've only recently acquired the Ford catalogue, so it's really a great sort of window into the world of that particular gunmaker. That's workshop plans, and you can see how it's gone backwards. And you get the house, building in the garden, more building in the garden, and not just one story, but 3. And that was done just before it was demolished. That was at 10 and 11 St Mary's Road. So again, very close to where that photograph was taken. You could probably just see it on the end. That's a typical gunmaker's workshop, terribly craft orientated with lots and lots of files. The windows are very interesting. They have this centre section that opens to admit some fresh air, and it's very typical of Birmingham industrial architecture. That's not dissimilar to the place where I worked in the 1980s. There are still workshops like that, and the tools haven't really changed very much. They're all very, very basic hand tools. There's a picture of gunmakers. I think it's about 1930, and you can see there that there's an elderly man there, and some, I guess they're probably middle-aged. No youngsters, no apprentices, because they said they regarded apprentices as competitors, and they're extolling the virtues of some gun they've just probably put together. It's a close-up of 2 even elderly men. I'm sorry for that slide, I should have cropped it a bit more. Looking at the lumps before they'd been filed and machined on a pair of shotgun barrels. And again, it's all hand work. The fore end, a piece of wood, that snaps onto that to protect your hand from the heat of the barrels and to act as a handle for you to steer the gun. That fore end will not fit on any other gun. It's unique to that gun because of the accuracy of the filing. We're back to Mr. Ford, and I think that's just a fantastic advert. He was really a very great self-publicist. And there's him at his boring bench, and you can see that his machine power comes not from a great engine or from water power, but from one of his assistants there cranking away that blooming great flying wheel. Whilst Ford, who was renowned as the best barrel borer in the trade, uses his boring bench there to produce a set of barrels. And those medals at the top, they were given to him by various people to recognise his ability in barrel boring. And they existed until about 5 years ago when they were nicked in a robbery, unfortunately. And I suspect that being gold, they have gone into a crucible somewhere, so they're lost to history. Great, great shame. To give you some idea of the sort of small nature of the trade, these are cuts out of the Metal Turner's Handbook, written by a chap called Paul Hasluck from 1882. The sort of thing that you get in an amateur workshop. That's the sort of thing the trade would have had. And even those are pretty advanced for the trade, which is very much a hand tool thing. They're called emery files. It just really means that you get a rotating belt of emery that does your filing for you a lot quicker. Not as accurate, but it takes the big bits off and you can finish it off very finely with a file. We can only really get that sort of degree of accuracy these days with computer numerically controlled machinery. And it's ironic really that the trade always had this huge amount of labour, and today many guns are produced by the CNC process and that labour's gone, those skills are lost. Portable forges, again from Hasluck, and there might have been 3 or 4 small craftsmen clubbed together and bought themselves one of those to do their hot work in a big batch, and they would probably get the components ready, perhaps when they were, say, hardening them, and they would get them all together and then fire it up. They would probably wait until lunchtime, because the best heat work was always done at lunchtime because the fire was at the hottest, because it built it up from the day, and then the less good stuff was made in the afternoon. And that's a sort of very, very minor scale. None of these great sort of brick forges or anything like that. They were just, forges that kept in the corner of the yard. Again, look at the lathes. Very, very primitive. And yet on those lathes, there were people turning out fantastically accurate work which, as I said, we can only achieve these days by CNC machinery. And yet they're very, very simple lathes by modern standards. And if somebody fancied having a bit of motive power, they'd have one of those. And that would drive by means of massive belts the emery mills and other things like that. And again, that was a portable thing that it says requiring no fixing. You could move it around. Yes, again, several men probably clubbed together to buy one. To bring machinery to this very, very labour-intensive craft industry, but only a tiny bit of machinery. That's St Mary's Row at the top. This is taken by a lady called Phyllis Nicklin, who was a lecturer in geography in the 60s, just before the gun quarter came down. That's a convent, funnily enough. Ironic, it's next to the Ward Central Gun Works, which has, again, its name painted on the bricks. And Ward's a remarkable firm. I cleared Ward's storerooms out in the 1980s, and there were all manner of components in there. It was an absolute Aladdin's cake. But they used to produce flintlock guns for the Africa trade, and I've seen one of them with post-1904 proof marks on it, so they were producing them as late as that. There's St Mary's Row again. You can see how they're very obviously dwelling houses, but they're industrial units. That's very interesting. That's St Mary's Row from the other end, and the big factory here with the coat of arms is Green's Prize Works, and that's very unusual in the Birmingham trade, and I think it was a big factory. I've known people who worked in there in the 1960s before it came down, and it was really a huge factory, but it was unusual. And I did a bit of calculation last night, and I think I got to one hand's worth of really big factories within the trade. There were very few and far between, most of them little tiny dwelling houses and subdivided into rooms. I think it's a great shame that that has been demolished, and I think, again, another fantastic industrial building gone like that. This is what I mean about the shopping. This is a chap called S. May, who was a locksmith, and I believe that he was a very skilled man, and yet he was working in a ramshackle place like that, built in the courtyard of number 11 St Mary's Road. We've seen the facade of it, and you can see up there stairs which went up to stories 2 and 3. So really very, very primitive buildings, but all gone now. This is very interesting. This is, again, St Mary's Row. It still exists today as a thoroughfare. Just about there, you will find Ronald McDonald House. I did a bit of work with the sat-nav on the car, and I'm pretty certain I've got the coordinates right. The General Hospital's going up, and you can see a girder frame building. The end where the green van is Sand Street. There are lots of gunmakers on Sand Street who do little jobs. And these railings here, were the railings of St Mary's Churchyard, and that section there still exists. And I've always rather fancied it in my garden, but I don't really think I'm capable of lifting several hundredweight of cast iron, so I fear it'll have to stay there. But there's just that tiny, tiny bit left of what used to be such a thriving place. Another one of the big factories, that's a Victorian cut of Hollis and Sheath's factory in Weeman Row and St Mary's Square. It's interesting, when you look at the street plan of that, the earliest one I can get back to, it gets nowhere near that. So I wonder whether Hollis and Sheath thought, oh, we'd better make ourselves look really big and people never buy anything from us if we have a pokey little address. So we'll have an imaginary factory. I don't know. I need to do more work on that. That's very interesting because that's William Tranter's factory at Aston Cross, which is quite a way away from the gun quarter. It's about a mile away. Tranter bought land deliberately away from the gun quarter because there was more space. It was near the canal. and it was probably cheaper. That is built in blue engineering brick, and you can see on the front there it says patent, revolver and military rifle factory, and that was Tranter's factory. And from my point of view, that was very interesting. That came down somewhere in the 1960s, and it then became Tube Investments car park, and my father was part of Tube Investments, and he was one of the directors, so he went to the site of that very frequently. And of course, it was Tranter who made this. At a pinch, this might have walked out to the front doors of that, but I suspect it probably came from St Mary's Road. That's Tranter's factory on the SAL particulars in 1890. He retired in 1885, and he leased the factory to George Kynock, who was the local MP, who was an ammunition magnate, and he ran it as the Kynock Gun Company. It didn't really take off, and went bankrupt, and they sold the assets off. I have the original SAL catalogue of it, and again, there's only one of those known, and I've yet to go through it and really find out all its secrets. But you can tell some idea of how big it was from just what it says there. There's a great factory engine there with the engine house. And also you get an idea of how many workmen there, because there were hooks in the men's restroom and canteen for 120 hats. So if Mr. Tranter, being a humane man, allocated one hook per hat, so do the maths. That's the interior of Tranter's factory as it was being sold. And up the front, you see these great stacks of French Chassepot needle gun rifles. They were being converted from the needle fire system, which used a very fragile combustible paper cartridge, paper reinforced with linen, into a brass cartridge, and were being flogged to the Chinese. They were converted by a process known as Schlund's patent. Henry Schlund was the foreman of the Aston Gun Company, and I have one of those. I haven't brought it with you today because I thought it was a bit dodgy walking through London with a long arm over your shoulder. You'd be shot to death for having a table leg, so I think you stood no chance with an antique gun. There are rows and rows and rows of emery files, very similar to the ones that we saw from the cuts from the Metal Turner's Handbook in the factory. And that's really the gun trade on an industrial scale, the industrial scale of which we understand it. Very, very unusual. And you see all those delineated in the sales particulars, and it says Block 48, emery file, made by whoever, and there's about 10 or 20 lots, as I said, ditto. It's a big factory. That's Bath Street in Birmingham, and that was one of the main thoroughfares of the trade. Go there, that's the spires of St Chad's Roman Catholic Cathedral. And they always called for the priest from St Chad's if there was an argument at the Bull Public House. Why they called for the priest, I don't know. Perhaps the good father frightened the living daylights out of the tumultuous gunmakers. Next door is the Salvation Army, and here are gunmakers' factories. And I used to work in that one there, that was Holloway. They're now student accommodation, and I'm delighted that they've been preserved almost exactly as they are. They must have had a job cleaning them out because the accumulated dust of ages in there was phenomenal. But they're now student accommodation, and they've survived. So that's one part of the industrial heritage that's been preserved. The square building here, which is a very posh-looking facade, but with absolutely really rubbishy building behind it, which goes down Loveday Street, that was William Bourne's factory. When I worked in Birmingham, it was a very, very grubby second-hand furniture warehouse. It's been recently done up and modernised, and it's now the offices of Parker Grigo Solicitors, and I'm delighted to say that they have instructed me in the past, and I was very pleased to attend their premises for a conference and tell them that they're actually in a very important industrial building from Birmingham. This is a bit of a mystery. This is on Belmont Road, and it's not quite like that now. Regrettably, it's burnt down, it's really only a very, very dangerous facade that's sitting up there, and I suspect it will be demolished before too long. This may well be Bone Hill's National Arms and Ammunition Company. Again, more work needs to be done on street plans to actually tie that building in there. But I think that's what it is, because I think that's the only factory of that size that is there, and the street plan and the traces suggest that that's probably it. But again, that's another fantastic industrial building going to be lost. Madam President, that's me done.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. We discussed earlier that it is our custom here to gather up questions, so have your pen at the ready. I think you're slightly alarmed by this, but I can see that you're poised.
Oh, years of taking notes in court.
Do we have any questions?
On that last slide, there was a name above. Can you not read what it says on that last slide you showed? It was quite a dark slide, wasn't it? But there was something and something.
Thank you. I'll do that.
Still taking notes. Just talking about the London trade, perhaps marketing their expensive guns better. I think it was more of a social thing that the upkeep of 100 guinea gun was going to go to the aristocracy. So during the season, the ladies were having their tea parties, the men were going to Tattersalls for their horses, Westerns for their clothes, and to their gunmakers for their guns. All the customers were there. And I'd also, what's fascinated me about this is for most of the lecture you could have said watchmakers instead of gun makers. Rows of people with different skills, all people other people putting them together, other people selling them, and now even particularly every piece is made on a CAD lathe. The parallel is just total.
I have two questions. Firstly, was there any connection between the gun trade in terms of making components and the other small metal industries in Birmingham, like chains, pens, needles? Did they help to make components? And my second question is, was there any social legislation governing the functioning of these family businesses, or was it all too early for that?
How much technical development originated within the trade in Birmingham? And do you know how many patents for ingenious devices were taken out by members of the trade?
In my local town of East Kent in the late 17th century, there was someone who called himself a gunsmith, and he was in the same place for about 20 years. Given that this was a small provincial town, is it likely he would actually made guns, or would he really walk in, or would he put together components?
You showed us the undeveloped interiors of these factories, and you pointed out they were rare. I just wondered whether there was a difference in the way they worked in those factories compared to in the more domestic workshops, or whether it was just a question of scale.
Oh, okay, one more.
Oh,
have you got two hats? I'm sorry.
One there.
Okay, two more.
You were talking about the growth of Musket factory operation in the 19th century.
Did they ever manage to achieve interchangeability? It's a great goal of factory work. Or was it always a matter of skilled fitting for the factory components?
Bill, the Birmingham trade was famous for producing guns for other people and indeed for London. You might add a few words perhaps about the flow of guns to London. The Holland and Hollands with, I think someone else mentioned marketing earlier. It might be the same question in fact. And lastly, a brief comment on what's there now. It's 10 years since I went to that site. You must have been there more recently. And there is still some work going on? Still some workshops?
Well, Bill, I think that's testament to the interest that you have engendered in our audience. I've never had quite so many questions come so fast. Fabian, over to you.
Mr. Cook, my old colleague in the trade. The name on the building isn't the name I think it ought to be. I suspect it's somebody who bought it afterwards. I think in my notes I have got a name of who it was. It isn't Burnhill. Yeah, it is, you're right, it is a very dark picture. I think I must have had my thumb over the lens on it. I'm trained for things like that, I'm not very technologically. Gentleman who spoke about marketing, I think your point's very well made about that social aspect of it, and if you were in London, you would go to the London trade, and for all that Birmingham had what was known as the Midlands Enlightenment, certainly in the 18th century, I think it was a pretty important centre for things happening in the Midlands, but really the sort of cachet of the London trade. You went to your gun maker, you went to your boot maker, whilst your wife went around the various tea party circuits. Madam, the connection between the gun trade, chain, pin and needle makers, nib makers, I suppose there must have been. I can't prove it, but I suspect that certainly people who worked in the gun trade, when it got quiet and there was no work, they worked in the chain industry because that was very, very, very similar. I think many of the other trades, they were very much sort of cheap metal stampings like nibs and certainly bracelets, and the trade really worked from forgings. Guns made from stampings are really in the Second World War phenomenon. You get a Sten gun, which was, I think was 5 and 6, was new, and that was made by the Birmingham trade out of stamping. Any little workshop could make it. So I don't think that connection was particularly great then, but there must have been people who just made a living at what they could. Social legislation. 1920s, the Pistols Act. No, sorry, the Firearms Act. There's the Pistols Act of 1983. The Firearms Act of 1920 was put up before Parliament to limit armed crime. If you look at the records, there was virtually no armed crime. There were celebrated examples of armed crime. They were mainly terrorists rather than people who were bent on robbery or anything like that. And in fact, in one fairly celebrated incident, the members of the Metropolitan Police who were pursuing these blokes who were armed had to stop members of the public and say, "Have you got a revolver I could borrow, please?" And one of them was eventually shot by an allotment holder. Yeah, so from the 1920s on, you see the Firearms Acts developing, and they are the worst piece of legislation I've ever in my life come to deal with. I was talking to the Law Commission a week ago, and the Law Commissioner, Professor David Ormerod QC, said that he thinks they're dreadful legislation. They need codifying, they need consolidating, to say the least. There's probably about 30 different statutes by the time you get it all together. There's always been hostile domestic legislation. And in more recent years, you see that from the killings after Blaine, you see hostile legislation after the killings in Hungerford as well. And by then the trade was really dying on its feet, but I have to say I don't think its help matters anything. Mr. Cormack, your patents for ingenious devices, hundreds. I've never counted them. I could do, if it helps you. But the London trade had people who were celebrated as inventors and they produced patents. The Birmingham trade did. I don't think you are anybody in gun making if you haven't got a patent to your name. And you get patents for all things. You look at me, you thought, patent attorneys this bloke higher because he's managed to get that one through. It's almost the same as one that was pushed through the week before. I do occasionally, when the mood takes me, better to read the abridgments of patent specs, and they're very, very interesting. From about 1865 to 1914, they're that much in Class 119, which is firearms. So it's a big area. The making of guns and assembling of them. You don't really see somebody who calls himself a gun maker operating properly in the provinces much after about 1840, because it was just simply too difficult to make breech-loading guns. Whilst it was fairly easy to get a set of forgings, and if you were a decent metalworker, assemble them into a gun. Before that, a muzzle-loading gun. You don't see it when you start to get breech-loading guns and all these ingenious patents. You would really need somebody who was very, very used to fine work rather than somebody who just took a kit of parts and put them together. Because I think from the end of the 18th century, you see gun making in big centres, like say Grantham, that's quite close to the Great North Road. And that was always, there was some great gun-making names came out of Grantham. They actually did make them. They made them from components, which probably came from Birmingham. But they actually did make the thing. Whereas from about sort of 1880, when it said Jones, gunmaker, Ludlow, he only touched it by putting it into his window to sell it. And you get people who are also whitesmiths, agricultural seed merchants, they sold guns as well. A lot of people sold guns who weren't necessarily gunsmiths. I think the gunsmith, as opposed to the gunmaker in the provinces, came to dominate really because he did repair work. I've recently cleaned up a gun for a colleague of mine who walked into my room one day and said, "Do I need a license for this?" And I found when I cleaned it, it said "down" Stockport, tiny mark on the breech, and I don't think that there was any way that Downs, who's noted in the directories, could have made a thing like that. The barrel was just too big, and it's a very, very difficult job making a barrel. And it was very interesting that as I restored this gun, I looked at it, I thought something doesn't fit here. And there were indications on the barrel that it was recycled. And that suggests that somebody had got a barrel that sat in the corner of his workshop for a while and had actually made it into a gun, because that's the hardest part of the thing to do. Not hard to make a lock, pretty difficult to do springs, but you can get those made. And I think that's one thing about Birmingham. If you wanted it, they'd make it for you. You really just had to say how much and when you wanted it by. Interior scale of factories. It was just simply a larger scale. You would get benches with workmen doing exactly the same job as two blokes sitting in an upstairs bedroom of number 13 St Mary's Road, which they'd rented the room for the week. But factories, they hired and fired people as they were required, and if you operated a machine in a factory, it was really pretty unusual because we just simply didn't make guns by machining. Whereas the Americans, they did, and if you look at a set of surviving photographs of Colts in Hartford and Connecticut, they're all working machinery, and they're actually shaping bits of metal with machines that did the same job time and time again, rather than shaping it and hand filing it. Interchangeability. The Enfield rifle musket of 1853 was made on interchangeable gauges at the Royal Small Arms Factory. The Americans had achieved interchangeability by 1820, I think. The Hall rifle produced by North of Harper's Ferry was interchangeable. The first interchangeable pistol was the Tranter, Singh-Tranter's factory, of 1879. And even then it wasn't interchangeable because the Royal Navy complained that the cartridges were very tight fit in the chamber, and the seamen, when they fired their six on their annual practice, and they found it difficult to eject the empties. So no, we were not good on interchangeability for a long time. Very much an American thing. Derek, what is there now? Not very much. There's the new buildings. I say new buildings, they were built in 1862 by Bentley and Playfair to capitalise on the American Civil War. They have 3 or 4 blokes in there doing repair work. C.H. Smith's on Price Street do a bit of repair work, and that's really about it. Even when I worked in Birmingham in the 1980s, there were probably only 10 people, 10 big firms, but there is very, very little. Gun making in this country is now bespoke gun making, and it's done in London for guns that cost you, I think a Purdy's, what, 54,000 or something like that. It's a lot of money when you consider that the Birmingham...
One of the cheap ones.
Sorry?
One
of the cheap ones, yeah. By the time you've got the engraver onto it, you probably double that, and you probably wait 3 years for him to do it. Whereas in engraving, if you look at the analysis on in Greener's book on gun making in Birmingham, the engraving was about 2.5% of it. It was very, very much regarded as an artisan craft and not a commercial artist of metal, as we have to call them today. I hope that's answered your question, so
Thank you very much indeed. I think very fully we've virtually had a whole new set of information as a result of the questions. Thank you very much indeed. And I have to say that this was a subject I didn't know a huge amount about. You told us you weren't going to burden us with academic detail. I think what you've done is what you really set out to do, inform and educate us through entertaining us. And I've certainly found, I think it's a fine example of how to make learning very accessible. And I certainly feel very much more interested in finding out more about this industry, about which I knew very little. And actually the General Secretary and I last night were in Bristol at the launch of a book by our fellow Roger Leach on development of medieval and later housing in Bristol. And it's provided a very interesting comparative lecture last night and tonight, because of course very similar things were happening in quite different industries in Bristol as they were in Birmingham. So it's been a great evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Madam President.